Hello, everyone. I'm Joanna Ramos-Romero, Professional Development and Training Specialist in Usaid's Office of Education. Welcome to the last session of the Global Education Learning Series. When we launched this learning series 5 months ago, we aimed to offer participants opportunities to learn about tools and resources to respond to emerging education programming challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic, gain exposure to education programming strategies, goals, and approaches, identify where and how USAID engages with non-traditional partners to enhance the design, funding, and implementation of education programs, and understand better the role of U.S. government education programming in a country's journey to self-reliance. As part of the series, we convened 9 webinars, created 10 Ignite Talks and a discussion group in LinkedIn with 261 members, and released 7 online learning modules on pre-primary education, disability-inclusive education, youth workforce development, reading and literacy, social and emotional learning, higher education, and education in crisis and conflict, for a total of over 17 hours of learning. We also heard from 52 SMEs, or subject matter experts, and reached about 1,000 education practitioners. Now, during this last event of the learning series, we will hear from USAID education leaders about 3 topics. First, how the global education landscape has changed since COVID-19. Second, how the U.S. government and USAID experiences, strategies, and policies continue to play a central and foundational role in our education work. And third, how USAID's education programs and staff are adapting to the new normal and coming out stronger. We hope that you will better understand how USAID's education work is transforming to better provide the necessary resources and support to those in the field. This webinar will consist of 3 successive 10-minute conversations on each of these 3 topics, followed by a moderated Q&A with the speakers. Feel free to enter your questions in the chat throughout this session for the speakers to address during the Q&A portion of this session. Our speakers are Leanna Marr, Director of USAID's Office of Education. Leanna has served as a USAID Foreign Service Officer since 2004 and has led education programming in a variety of missions, including Guinea, South Sudan, Macedonia, and Morocco. She has a master's in international education policy from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Robert Burch is a Foreign Service Officer and serves as a Deputy Director in USAID's Office of Education. He has managed education programming and missions in the Philippines and Egypt and has worked as a teacher, teacher trainer, and evaluator of education programs in the US, Thailand, Yemen, and Saudi Arabia. He holds a master's in linguistics from California State University, Fresno. Charles Kiami is a Deputy Director in USAID's Office of Education. He previously served as Acting Director and Deputy Director of USAID's Office of Local Sustainability, Regional Program Coordinator in USAID's Middle East Bureau, and Lead Foreign Affairs Officer in the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. He holds a PhD in Government and Arab Studies from Georgetown University. Patrick Collins serves as a Division Chief in USAID's Office of Education. He provides international engagement and design, evaluation, and program management support to over 50 USAID missions globally and provides input on USAID's Foreign Service workforce planning and onboarding. He has a master's in international education development from Boston University. Jessica Lopez is a Division Chief in USAID's Office of Education. During her 10 years as a Foreign Service Officer, she has focused on increasing access and quality of basic and higher education and on promoting educational, economic, and civic opportunities for girls and youth. She holds a master's in international education policy from Teachers College, Columbia University. Joni Cohen-Mitchell serves as a Division Chief in USAID's Office of Education. She has worked as a program implementer, providing organizational, programmatic, evaluation, and staff development services, and focusing on early grade reading and basic education, early childhood education, adult literacy, and community engagement. She has a doctorate in international education from the University of Massachusetts. Now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Robert Burch and Charles Kiami for our first discussion.
Thanks very much, Joanna. Hi, Robert. It's good to see you. Hey, good to see you too, Charles.
Robert, I think it's really important that we take stock and acknowledge all the really drastic changes as a result of the pandemic. At one point, it could be said reasonably that close to 90% of schools around the world closed for a time. That 1.6 billion learners were affected considerably by COVID-19 in at least 194 countries. On average, we estimate that in low and middle income countries, students lost about 4 months of instruction, at least. And so I think it's important that we take stock of where we were and where we are and where we're going with regard to education and COVID-19. So I'd love to ask you a few questions. My first one for you is, within this context, what were some of the challenges that we initially anticipated for our partner countries?
Well, Charles, with those statistics that you just quoted, we recognized early on that the impact of this pandemic would be significant. We knew that for safety and the security of both teachers and students, schools were going to need to close. And we also knew that the longer learners were out of school due to school closures, the less likely they would be to return, particularly youth, displaced learners, and learners living in extreme poverty, the marginalized and most vulnerable children and youth. We knew that efforts to mitigate some of the risks of students dropping out would be needed to sustain some sort of safe distance education for those students who'd left the classroom. Additionally, those continued education practices would help provide learning opportunities to students, keeping a pulse on learning, potentially limiting backsliding. However, it became clear that there would be learning loss despite any efforts. We weren't sure in the early days what that meant in terms of months or years. And initially we were thinking, as you mentioned earlier, about 4 months, but now it is looking like the impact will be far greater and that children's learning and youth learning loss may be up to a full year or more. We suspected and learned quickly, often through our own experiences here in the United States, that for distance learning or other education support initiatives to be effective, governments, parents, civil society, the private sector, and all education actors needed to work in partnership to seek new efficient ways and innovative ways to respond to the crisis.
Yeah, I want to dig in on that a little bit more, Robert, if you don't mind. With regard to USAID's work in particular, what kinds of things came to light early in the pandemic about how COVID-19 and nationwide school closures were impacting learners, families, educators, and education systems broadly?
Well, Charles, almost immediately after the crisis hit in early March, the Office of Education mobilized a COVID-19 education task force. This task force drew on regional expertise, input from those on the ground, our own office expertise, and the experiences of a large group of other education stakeholders. It allowed us to better understand the situation and address the issues facing the education systems worldwide. The task force helped shine light on the impact of school closures on the marginalized and vulnerable children and youth. We knew that marginalized learners struggled, even pre-COVID-19, to attend and achieve learning outcomes. And now with schools closed, we knew that girls, children with disabilities, the very poor, displaced learners, and other vulnerable groups would face increased risks in their homes and communities, limiting their ability to sustain learning. These risks included violence, abuse and exploitation, possible early marriages, child labor, and other serious health risks. We also learned more about the risks facing teachers. And as mentioned earlier, there were risks of children and youth not returning to the classroom. Because of all of these challenges, we knew from day one that we would have to simultaneously respond in the short term and plan for the long term. We knew recovery would not be linear, but would require both temporary intensive response and sustainable forward-learning, long-term planning.
Well, I want to go in a slightly related but different direction, Robert, and to ask you about some of the specific things that the agency did to respond to some of those concerns that you surfaced. What role did our partners play as well in the response?
So, Charles, at the global level, we leveraged our comparative advantage in a number of ways. We looked at our experiences in using distance learning, looking at the well-being of learners and educators, looking at safely opening schools and accelerating learning to make up learning loss, and also looked at the work that we've carried out in the area of higher education. The task team held regular calls with the field to get a better idea of what was happening on the ground. And we drew on the input and also requests from the field offices to develop evidence-based tools and resources. And we developed a number of these tools and resources for the field. The first one, which came out very quickly after the pandemic hit, was the COVID-19 and Education Initial Insights for Preparedness, Planning, and Response. We also developed resources and tools for monitoring and evaluating and learning during the pandemic, delivering distance learning, fostering resilience through social-emotional learning, higher education landscape reviews, case studies in higher education, and other resources and tools. We also held timely webinars to walk through these resources and ensure that field offices felt comfortable applying them to their education programs. We also added a resource page on EduLinks, which is our education online platform, we added the education resources in response to coronavirus, where a large volume of resources and tools are housed. The Higher Education Working Group looked at the role of higher education and the role that higher education institutions play in responding to the pandemic, and they shared their learning with the sector. We were also able to leverage and repurpose earlier USAID investments made in interactive radio and interactive audio instruction. Specifically, in this area, we did three things. We launched a global working group on distance learning in emergencies. We collected and curated a repository of existing interactive radio and interactive audio materials and housed them on education links, including reference documents to assist with those who are using the resources. We also hosted a number of webinars and training opportunities to support the global education community in pivoting to distance learning in the times of crisis. I'll give you a few examples of those, Charles, a little bit later. You also asked about partnerships. Well, we knew we couldn't do this in isolation, and so we leveraged efforts from across the education community. We collaborated closely with GPE, the Global Partnership for Education, ECW, Education Cannot Wait, GBA, the Global Book Alliance, the World Bank, and also select UN agencies. We also partnered closely with the Interagency for Education in Emergencies. And we supported our field offices as they worked with implementing partners to quickly pivot programming to respond to the new environment. We convened donors in the private sector to coordinate our joint actions. The sector moved quickly and collaborated closely to respond. For example, the Global Book Alliance response to COVID was to fast-track the development of a cross-platform search tool aligned with the Global Digital Library, which led to a much wider access and availability of reading materials for our field offices. I could go on, but let me turn this back over to you, Charles.
I'm sure you could. Thank you, Robert. I'd actually like to hear more about some of the specifics regarding the pivot that you referenced earlier. So not just the development of new materials, new resources, and building global partnerships, but also thinking about the ways in which existing programs were adapted to respond to COVID-19. Would you share some specific examples for us about those changes and how you really met the moment?
Sure. So since I mentioned the work that USAID had been engaged in interactive radio instruction, let me provide an example from Nigeria. So even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the education system was very fragile, particularly in northern Nigeria, where 30% of children did not have access to basic education and lacked adequate parental support. The mission moved quickly to respond to the pandemic. In collaboration with UNICEF, the education team built on local relationships and past experiences to develop more than 40 interactive radio programs that have reached more than 400,000 students and parents throughout northern Nigeria. In Morocco, thanks to distance learning training that had been provided previously to the Ministry of Education, national education experts were prepared to respond to the pandemic. And the team in Morocco worked with the Ministry of Education to provide distance learning courses available on Moroccan television and also online. This allowed for the continuation of learning to many students in the country. And also in Vietnam, we have another example of a public-private partnership. In order to respond to the COVID-19 outbreaks in the country, USAID partnered with the global healthcare company Novartis to train nearly 2,500 medical students at 10 Vietnamese higher education medical schools on COVID-19 care and treatment. These healthcare workers were then deployed across the country to address the crisis. I hope these examples give you a feel for what happened on the ground.
Well, they certainly do, Robert, but they also prompt me to think about what comes next, not just what we've done, but where are we going? And I want to ask in particular about how the agency is prioritizing. So moving forward from this point, what would you say the agency has determined are the most critical things that need to happen for full educational recovery from COVID-19?
So we know that educators across the globe are trying to return to learning, whether that is in person, remotely, or a hybrid of the two. And what we want to do and what our priority is to support their planning and decision making. So in response, we've developed a new toolkit called Return to Learning During Crisis that includes ways to re-engage with all learners, especially the most marginalized, develop reopening plans for schools, adapt and modify instructional and learning plans, adjust examination and learner promotion strategies, and re-engage educators and prepare learning spaces for the return to the classroom. The tool is highly interactive and it's designed to be used to support host country decisions and priorities and can be found again on EduLinks. We also want to work with local education authorities to sustain investments in education policies and programs that build the resilience of the education system, so that in times of crises, education systems are poised to better respond. You know, Charles, there's both risk and opportunity in crisis. While the vulnerable and most marginalized are often disproportionately affected, the pandemic also presents an opportunity to re-engage all learners with more flexible ways to learn. This includes using interactive radio, interactive audio instruction, learning through television, distance education opportunities where possible, pivoting higher education institutions to respond to crises, the use of mobile applications, and we hope new low-cost inventions will be discovered moving forward, helping to reduce future shocks and stressors. We cannot just aspire to return to the way things were before. Education, even before the pandemic, was in crisis, and we need to think differently to address the challenges facing all of us in this sector. Let's look for ways to ensure a brighter future. Back to you, Charles.
I can't thank you enough, Robert, especially for that last point on innovation. I think you really hit the nail on the head. And I'm in awe every day of my colleagues in the agency that are really attempting to think creatively, not just about new opportunities, but making sense of and repurposing old opportunities for this new environment. Thank you very much, Robert, for the opportunity to talk to you about the way in which the agency has stepped up truly in response to this unprecedented situation. I really appreciate the time with you.
Well, thanks. And thanks, Charles, for the opportunity for me to share some of my thoughts with you. And I also want to thank the COVID-19 Education Task Force, the Office of Education, our regional colleagues, and most importantly, our education teams in the field for everything that they do. Thanks, all of you.
Indeed, it's a true team effort. Thanks, Robert, and back to you, Joanna.
Thank you, Robert and Charles, for that engaging conversation. Now we'll turn it over to Patrick Collins and Jessica Lopez for our next discussion.
Thanks, Joanna, and good morning, Jessica.
Good morning, Patrick.
By the way, very, very cool backdrop you have there.
Oh, thank you. Great instruments.
Thank you. So we've heard about the significant challenges and responses to COVID-19 in the previous session. And in this conversation, we would like to focus on how we can accelerate implementation of our education strategy and policy. To start, it's been 2 years since the new U.S. government basic education strategy and Usaid education policy have been in effect. Can you share the original goals of these and how each of them are changing and improving Usaid's education work?
Well, first of all, the U.S. government strategy on international basic education aims to strengthen education systems in partner countries so that all individuals there can acquire the education and skills needed to become productive members of society. The USG strategy is improving coordination across our government. Since implementing the strategy, we have built cross-agency relationships, learned from evaluations and evidence, and improved coordination at the country level. USAID's education policy aims to achieve sustained, measurable improvements in learning outcomes and skills development. There are 6 key principles that guide all USAID education investments under the 2018 policy. 1, prioritize country focus and ownership. 2, focus and concentrate investments on measurably and sustainably improving learning and educational outcomes. 3, strengthen systems and develop capacity in local institutions. 4, work in partnership and leverage resources. 5, drive decision-making and investments using evidence and data. And 6, promote equity and inclusion. The USAID policy is recognizing chances for local solutions, strengthening connections to learning outcomes, and creating new partnerships with the private sector.
Could you share the impact that the strategy and policy are having?
Of course. Coordinated efforts in fiscal year 2019 have achieved several positive results. To begin with, a strong foundation for more than 3.1 million children in 21 countries by providing nutrition services that foster the physical, cognitive, linguistic, and social-emotional development of young children so they are prepared to learn. Second, improving foundational skills for more than 35.6 million primary and secondary students in 53 countries by providing opportunities to learn literacy, numeracy, and other basic skills in formal and non-formal settings. Third, investment of more than $800 million in USAID basic education programs aligned with the USG strategy, reaching more than 32 million children and youth, particularly the most marginalized and vulnerable, including girls, those in rural areas, individuals with disabilities, young people from poor households, and those in crisis and conflict environments. And finally, preparing young people for productive futures by providing more than 892,000 individuals with tertiary, vocational, and workforce training.
Thank you very much, Jessica. You've been an education officer between the old and the new strategies and policy, and you've also been very much involved in our growing youth workforce development programs. What has been your experience with how the new strategy and policy are working, including impact at the country level and in specific technical areas?
Well, there's a lot to say on this topic, but I will focus on a couple of examples. One of the main goals of the USAID education policy is long-term systemic reform. A good example of where systemic reform has been successful is USAID's early grade reading program in Kenya, known as Tusome, which means let's read in Kiswahili. This program has spanned both old and new education strategies and policy. Its success has demonstrated the importance of ongoing long-term support and working side by side with government partners and local stakeholders to achieve sustainable educational outcomes. This new policy embraces and enables this approach. Now in its final year, Tusome, funding, oversight, and implementation are transitioning to the government of Kenya and various local entities. Another important aspect of the new education policy is its enhanced approach to youth, workforce development, and higher education. As a result, there's a greater emphasis on systems level and cross-sectoral interventions. that address the diverse needs of youth with respect to both education and workforce. The policy provided a framework that enabled us to produce 2 new global procurement mechanisms that promote goals of partnership, sustainability, and collaboration with local organizations. One of those mechanisms is the Higher Education for Leadership, Education, and Exchange Annual Program Statement, abbreviated as Helix APS, which aims to improve higher education at the individual, institutional, and/or systems level by supporting opportunities for partnerships, scholarships, exchanges, and other relevant forms of capacity development. The second new mechanism is the Youth Power 2 Annual Program Statement, abbreviated as Youth Power 2 APS, which is designed to serve youth programming by engaging youth-led and youth-serving organizations and systems to improve cross-sectoral youth development outcomes and to facilitate participation in the workforce. The YP2 APS provides flexibility for USAID to collaborate with youth, their communities, and relevant institutions, sectors, and systems.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. I agree, by the way. There's been a lot of exciting work and progress in recent years, and it's particularly encouraging to see the magnitude of impact that can be achieved where we're able to have a strategic focus over time, including system support and strong partnerships with governments and other partners on the ground, as you've described. For our last question, what is your hope for how the strategy and policy continue to ground Usaid's education work?
My hope is that the new strategy and policy will encourage us to build on previous successes, while at the same time providing significant new opportunities for collaboration and flexibility. Our hope is that this increased emphasis on broad collaboration, both within the U.S. government and with partner countries, will continue to improve outcomes across the education continuum. Ultimately, providing children and youth with the skills needed to become productive members of society. Most importantly, the new policy gives us flexibility to adapt to individual country contexts and priorities, as well as to worldwide changing circumstances. The policy is not rigid. It enables us to look country by country and reassess how we do business. We believe the enhanced possibilities for collaboration and flexibility will also bring increased opportunities for leveraging partners and resources and for cross-sectoral programming. At the same time, we will look for opportunities to continue to adapt our education programs to COVID-19 and help our partners as they move through their journey to self-reliance.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jessica. I'm optimistic as well. In addition to the points you've raised, I'm encouraged by the quality of all our staff at missions as well as in DC, and also by the fact that we've already begun to bring on a large number of new Education Foreign Service officers, because we all know that our people are our greatest resource.
Absolutely. I agree.
Thank you so much again, and Joanna, back to you.
Thanks, Jessica and Patrick, for that informative conversation. Now it's over to Leanna Marr and Joni Cohen-Mitchell for our next discussion.
Thanks, Joanna. Hi, Leanna.
Hey, Joni. How are you today?
I'm great. Wow, this has really been a year of changes, from COVID-19 to organizational changes at USAID. The changes have been big, and they've really helped USAID better adapt and better serve missions and partners and become more effective in reaching development outcomes. I'm going to ask you some questions so we can talk a little bit more about this. Are you ready?
I am.
So the first question, what are the organizational changes that are happening at USAID and specifically in the Office of Education?
Great. Thanks, Joni. And as we are here closing this Global Education series, I can't help but think how much has changed in just 5 short months since we opened the series in June. Some things haven't changed. So here at Usaid Washington, most of us are still on telework status, working from our home. Some of our education field officers are also still on authorized departure, though we're seeing growing numbers now returning to post. There have been many changes this year at Usaid, not only due to the changing development context due to COVID, but also because of the agency's transformation process. So I'm sure many of you have heard about transformation and have been following along with us. We're working to transform our programs, our structures, our processes, and our workforce. Again, I'm sure you're familiar with many of these changes, from the New Partners Initiative to procurement reform or to increased private sector engagement. In the education sector, this has resulted in some exciting new partnerships over the past year with Lego, Google, Ian Reality, just to name a few. We're using co-creation and more flexible procurement mechanisms. We've joined forces with many new partners in higher education, basic education, and youth programming. So a lot of the changes are super exciting and bringing in new partners to work with us. On transforming the structure, so USAID currently is located in the USAID's education office is currently located in Ddi Bureau. Soon, we will be the Center for Education in the new Bureau of Development, Democracy, and Innovation, or DDI. This bureau will be more flexible and much more field-oriented. So within the DDI Bureau, it will include a number of centers, which will provide integrated agency-wide sector leadership, backstop support, and technical assistance and expertise in particular sectors. We'll also have hubs that will work on cross-cutting priorities such as inclusive development and youth. The goal of the DDI Bureau really is to reorient Washington technical expertise towards the field. Changes will, for example, draw upon a network of expertise from across the Bureau centers and hubs. So we're really trying to ensure that we have more comprehensive cross-cutting support in DDI that reflects the complexity and interconnectedness of the different sectors and priorities. Client services will be our top priority. We already focus on that, and we're going to strengthen that. Our primary client will be our field missions and our implementing partners. DDI teams will hold ourselves accountable to the field for the provision of high-quality services. In particular, with the Office of Education, we'll probably see fewer changes than many other centers and hubs in DDI. We're going from the Office of Education to the Center for Education, and we're what's been affectionately dubbed a lift and shift. So most of our staff, their technical areas of responsibilities will be the same. Our day-to-day work will look very much the same to many of you. So within DDI, the new Center for Education, one of our biggest changes is, rather than being aligned around subsector teams, we'll be reorienting the office to focus on functional areas aligned with the DDI Bureau priorities. So our 4 functional areas will be policy and technical leadership, evidence and learning, cadre development or professional development, and client services to our missions and partners. So we'll be really working in a much more flexible matrix structure, and we really hope that this will help decrease stovepiping across subsectors. We're really hoping that you will see in the field more coordinated planning and distribution of knowledge products across our subsectors and for technical support. This does include coordination and collaboration with the other centers and hubs in DDI. We also want to look at really increasing the opportunities for field missions to feed into our sector priorities, helping us decide what should be our annual priorities, what are the needed tools and knowledge products. You'll be hearing more about that soon. And we want to be more flexible and responsive to new priorities and changing contexts. And once again, we hope to see less stovepiping in subsectors across the office or new center.
Thank you, Leanna. Wow, those are big structural changes, not only outside the Office of Education or soon to be Center for Education, but inside as well. Can you go into a little more detail to tell me how this will affect the work with mission and partners and other stakeholders who work with us to further the education goals of USAID?
Sure. So maybe what we'll do is just give a few very specific examples of some of the changes we're planning. So in the Center for Education, we're hoping to kind of elevate work planning to a higher, more strategic level. In the past, we've done individual work plans for each subsector. Now we want to look at work planning across those functional areas. And we want to, from the very beginning of establishing an annual work plan, include field inputs as to what our field officers and partners believe our annual work priorities should be. So where, for example, might you want a little extra technical assistance? Are there knowledge products or tools that you need in new areas of programming? Again, we want to be more collaborative as we really plan for our work for the year. We hope to see more coordination on the development and distribution of knowledge products and tools. So, we've heard some feedback that we produce a very high quality knowledge products and tools, but we produce a lot of them, and many times they're coming out at the same time. So we want to see how we best coordinate both the development and distribution of these products. And then there'll be a renewed focus on country support teams and the use of UTRAMs to request technical support. This hopefully will mean a more coordinated effort, not only in DDI, but with our colleagues in the regional bureaus. Some of the really exciting things also, we're in the process of launching 2 new mechanisms, both of which will help really expand the knowledge base in the education sector. And we want to build in some of these principles and priorities into how we do business with these new mechanisms. So the first is SHARE, or Supporting Holistic and Actionable Research in Education. This new mechanism will help USAID advance our learning priorities in the international education sector. And if you aren't familiar with our learning agenda, you can actually look that up. We have all of our learning agendas posted on EduLinks. But SHARE will really focus on primary research and helping us answer questions on our learning agendas. But what's super exciting about this is that we'll partner with higher education institutions in the country where we are working for data and evidence. And so we'll be building capacity in country at the same time as we're building our knowledge base. So I'm super excited about SHARE. The other large mechanism is Leading Through Learning Global Platform. This activity is really a follow-on to our networks, the Global Reading Network and the Education in Crisis and Conflict networks. Both of these activities helped us to expand our knowledge base and technical leadership. What we're doing with Leading Through Learning, however, is having a single platform where we work in these areas across all of the subsectors in the education sector at USAID. So I think that'll be really exciting, and again, will help us to break down some of this stovepiping. Another really exciting thing about Leading Through Learning, in the past, our networks of practice have tended to be Washington-based, but with Leading Through Learning, we're going to be looking at how we have a more regional approach. And with that, what we're hoping is to really incorporate experts from the countries we're working in, and also make sure that our mission staff and our implementing partners out in the field have way more opportunity to participate in these platforms and in these communities of practice. So again, we're super excited about that. And we really see this as strengthening the linkages and relationships between data and evidence and between the generators and users of data and evidence. Finally, I just want to highlight our youth work. So as you know, we've always done quite a bit of youth work, and now we've launched in September a new activity called Global Lead. This is really an umbrella mechanism that brings together all of the youth work across the agency. Global Lead aims to mobilize 1 million young leaders over the next 5 years to guide their country's development on issues of education, civic engagement, and leadership development. At the heart of Global Lead is USAID's new partnerships initiative, which works with local, new, and underutilized youth-led and youth-serving organizations to accelerate progress in partner countries in the journey to self-reliance. So I'm super excited about this. So we continue to work in the same areas. We continue to build on the foundations that we have from previous partners, but really looking at drawing in new partnerships, at really utilizing expertise and bridging that kind of gap between Washington and the field.
These are such excited changes for USAID's education work. I'm really excited about how we're hoping to really catalyze dialogue, knowledge generation with mission partners and implementing partners to really look at a more holistic, systemic impact. What about you, Leanna? What is most exciting to you about what's happening at USAID and the Center for Education?
Thanks, Joni. So I think as a field officer, one of the things I'm much more excited about and passionate about is strengthening the linkages between the field and headquarters here at USAID. So both with our field missions and implementing partners, really making sure that our client services are demand driven and that we're providing what the field needs, helping our field missions really take development to the next level. I really think that this offers the opportunities to align how we work with the latest thinking on both aid and organizational effectiveness. It will allow us to take our thought leadership to the next step vis-a-vis mission staff and partners, and it will help amplify and strengthen our partnerships. There's still so much work that needs to be done in the education sector. We've made huge strides, but we all know the financing gap is huge. We're making progress towards improved learning outcomes, but there's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done and acceleration that could be done in this area. And we know that no donor or country can do this alone. So I'm really excited about strengthening these partnerships. Thanks, Joni.
Thank you so much, Leanna. This is very exciting, and I'm so excited to join you in the work of the Center for Education at USAID. Joanna, back to you.
Thank you, Leanna and Joni, for that enlightening conversation. Now we're going to transition to the Q&A portion of our session today. I'd like to invite all our speakers to turn on their cameras as we take questions from the audience. All right, so we have a question from William Dant. William says, I specialize in MEL services and have worked with several USAID missions on measuring the impact of their programs. This usually involves extensive field-based and site-based research, but given circumstances, in what ways will USAID do such impact measurement? I think, Robert, that would be a great question for you.
Thanks, Joanna, and thanks, William, for that really insightful question. And you are absolutely right. COVID has had a marked impact on the way that we can collect the field and report on monitoring and evaluation and impact. USAID has responded to that by the development of a monitoring, evaluation, and learning guidance during COVID, which we are, I believe, is probably available all week. You can find it on EduLinks, and it goes through some of the recommendations that that this education sector is making in terms of monitoring and evaluation. The first and most important is do no harm, and that is to ensure safety for everyone involved during this crisis. There is also a lot of other guidance within that document that I think people will find very useful in how you can make adjustments. And yes, adjustments are acceptable. In fact, we are encouraging that as long as you're communicating the changes that you're making in your monitoring, evaluation, and learning plans to move forward. So I highly recommend that people take a look at that guidance, and we'll make sure that we send that link around to people as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robert. And we have a question from Andrea Naletto. Has USAID developed or collected guidance material on no-tech distance education options? Joe, I think that would be a great question for you.
Thank you. Thanks, Joanna, and thanks, Andrea, for this incredibly timely question. This is on everyone's mind, isn't it? The need for thinking about no-tech and low-tech solutions in the immediate, and then moving further forward as we build back better and really incorporate resilience principles into our education systems for the next crisis that is inevitable at some point. So we've done a number of things that I'm excited to tell you about. And again, we ask everyone to look at EduLinks. We just completed a distance learning literature review that looks at a number of low or no tech options for you to consider. And right now we're actually in the process, of finishing up 8 different case studies that look at return to learning. So very contextualized approaches to low tech and no tech solutions, how we impart and think about the foundational skills of learning in settings that are less than ideal. So I encourage everyone to comb through EduLinks and stay tuned for the return to learning case studies, which should be complete by summertime. Thank you, Andrea.
Great, thanks, Joni. And we have a question from Amal Nasrallah. Does USAID have plans to evaluate or did evaluate the online learning experience of school students during the COVID pandemic and the possible challenges identified? Robert, could you take that one as well?
Sure. Good morning, Dr. Nasrallah. That is a very good question. And yes, USAID has been very much interested in looking at the challenges surrounding distance learning. We have not yet done a formal evaluation of those challenges. However, we are working on indicators that will look at reach of distance learning and also encouraging our missions to report on those challenges through narrative at this point as they're reporting back on some of the programming that they're experiencing in the field. Obviously, there are lots of challenges. We are highly aware of the fact that the most marginalized and vulnerable are the ones that are going to be most affected by the challenges surrounding technology, hardware, software, connectivity, and all of those other challenges that we're facing. So it is of great interest to us, and we will be looking at that more carefully as we move forward. Over.
Thank you, Robert. And we have a question from Susan Ayari. How is USAID assuring that missions have the capacity needed to successfully use these new mechanisms and advance USAID's policy? I think that would be a great question for Patrick and also Jessica. Patrick, you want to start us off?
Sure, I'll start. First of all, hi, Susan. And it's great to hear from you and also to see so many familiar names on this webinar. So there's a couple things. One is we do have a very, very robust training program that's currently taking place. It's led by Joanna and a professional development working group. There continues to be a strong element of field support by Washington staff, regional bureau staff to help us all learn from each other, not just within aid, but also for aspects of aid related to the new policies and strategies. I would also add from a structural standpoint, it's very exciting that we have 30 new foreign service officers joining us in the next couple of years. We have 5 this year so far, and we anticipate several more in the next coming years. So that'll make a big difference. And in addition, what we've tried to do is consolidate our resources so that we have a critical mass of funding between higher ed and basic education and any mission program that's approved so that there's sufficient money to have somebody that's actually able to manage the program from the aid standpoint. And we found over time that that's absolutely critical. So we're not fully staffed up yet, but we've got a lot of things in progress or underway in terms of training that are making a difference. Jessica, let me see if you have other things to add.
Oh, thanks, Patrick. Just to add on to that, around the question around mechanisms, we currently have many mechanisms in Washington around youth, higher education, knowledge sharing, and research. So these various different ones, we have activity managers and AOR CORs, and those individuals are coordinating support to missions. So please do reach out to us if you are interested in using one of them.
Great, thank you both. And we have a question from Eric. I represent the University of Arizona, he says. Excited to see efforts to engage HEIs, higher education institutions. Would be interested to hear more about how USAID will engage HEIs in the US and overseas in the future. Leanna, could you take that question? I think that would be great for you. And then maybe Jessica, if you want to jump in.
Sure. Thanks, Joanna. It's a great question. And higher education institutions are really a very important partner for us, both here in the US and overseas. There's so many different ways that USAID works with higher education institutions, not just in the education office, but really across every sector. Recently, we did a landscape analysis of the work of higher education institutions with USAID, and we found that there are over 800 different partnerships going on supporting different sectors. Specifically with the Education Office, we oversee the Higher Education Partnership Initiative, and so there are co-creation events that are ongoing from year to year as we select the partners to work for with that. We do that through our new mechanism called Helix, and Jessica can speak to that in just a moment. But I would say for those of you, and also we spoke earlier about our learning agenda, and higher education institutions are playing a very critical role in helping USAID look at its learning agenda and to expand our knowledge base. So there are also opportunities there. But I do encourage higher education institutions to really keep an eye on fedbiz.gov and other places where USAID announces grants. And don't just look at education, look at agriculture, look at health, economic growth, really look broadly across the board because we do utilize higher ed really within every sector. Jessica, could you speak a little bit about Helix?
Sure. As I mentioned before, the Helix annual program statement is an unfunded umbrella mechanism that missions can use to engage with higher education institutions to be central actors in development in their countries. And so far we have had that annual program statement will be good for 5 years, and it started in the spring, and already several missions have utilized it. So we encourage you, if you are interested, to contact the Office of Education about that. Samantha Alvis is the activity manager on that, and we can coordinate and find the appropriate way to move forward.
Wonderful. And I think we have time for one last question. We have a question from Kelsey. What does the USAID's partners? Leanna, I think that would be a great question for you.
Great. Thank you, Joanne. And I just want to give a shout out, Jerry Mendez. Hi, I see you've been online and also had asked a question about where staff will be sitting within DDI. The one thing I do want to say is that although we may be sitting in different places, our technical staff retain their technical expertise and will be working in the same areas that you all know them from. So those relationships that you have with our staff and ways of engaging with us, that will continue in the same way, no matter what. So we encourage you to reach out, Jerry. We know you work very closely with Josh and Leah on inclusive development, and they'll be an integral part of DDI in helping us think through inclusive development for the education sector. So again, I think the day-to-day and our relationships will look very much the same. What might look a little different really has to do with more the broader agency transformation and how we're doing business. And I know many of you are already adjusting us in new ways of doing procurement, such as co-creation. I know this past year we had a very exciting co-creation process that included 10 youth-led, youth-serving organizations from different countries in Africa. So that's one way, I think, key for USAID and the journey to self-reliance, that both USAID and our implementing partners are working much more closely and much more meaningfully local organizations NGOs, so that we're really bringing on board and building the capacity as a part of the journey to self-reliance. But as far as your relationship with our office, well, actually, as of yesterday, late in the day, we are now the Center for Education in DDI. Our relationships and the way we work with our partners will remain the same. So I encourage you to reach out to your contacts as needed. Thanks, Joanna.
Great. Thank you, Leanna. And as we start to wrap up our session, and it's bittersweet for me to say, but also wrap up the Global Education Learning Series, I just wanted to invite the audience for you all to write your key takeaways from our webinar this morning. So feel free to start writing that in the chat. And as we wait for your takeaways to come in, I'd like to also invite our panelists to share their takeaways in the form of a tweetable quote. So let's start off with Jessica, your tweetable quote. Jessica, you're on mute. Sorry, Jessica, you're still on mute. We're going to go to Patrick and then come back to you. Go ahead, Patrick.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all so much for taking the time to join us. I guess I would say with COVID, we all realized, if we didn't already, that we're truly all in this together. And eyes on the prize. Stay safe.
Thank you. Jessica.
Okay, the USG strategy and the USAID policy promote broad collaboration and flexibility that will allow us to adapt to country contexts and changing circumstances, ultimately leading to improved learning outcomes.
Great, thank you. And Charles, you're up.
Joanna, thank you so much. I'm impressed each day with my colleagues' drive for innovation and excellence. We're really making lemonade from lemons every day, aren't we? Thank you so much.
Yes, we are. Thank you, Charles. And Robert.
I just want all of our mission colleagues, as well as all of our implementing partners who continue to support our partner countries in improving education outcomes for children and youth, particularly in these difficult times. So,
great. Thank you, Robert. Joni, what's your tweetable quote?
Thanks, Joanna, and thanks everyone for listening today. USAID's new Center for Education is excited to deepen our collaboration work with missions, implementing partners, and other stakeholders to further education outcomes across the globe.
Thank you, Joni. And finally, Leanna, what is your tweetable quote for us to close us out?
Well, as usual, I don't always follow the rules. So before I do my tweetable quote, I just feel like I would be remiss if I didn't recognize you, Joanna, and the incredible work that you've done and talking about taking lemons and making lemonade and going over 800 people enrolled in April, and we had to cancel because of COVID, and turning it into this amazing 5-month-long global education learning series. I just feel that you've taken our professional development to new heights, and you've done a phenomenal job facilitating today. So thank you for all that you're doing with that. We really greatly appreciate it. And now I will leave you with my tweetable quote. But with so many changes this year, I'm excited that the transformations happening at USAID and in the education sector will help us better adapt and serve missions and partners. These will ultimately help us become more effective in our work. So thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Leanna, for your kind words and also your words of wisdom. And thank you, everyone, all of our partners, all of our colleagues throughout the agency, throughout USG. Thank you for joining us today and for your active participation and attention. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.